Good evening, everyone. My name is Jude Philp. I'm Senior Curator of the Macleay Collections, and it is my privilege to acknowledge that I'm speaking from Gadigal country. I hope you're well from whatever Aboriginal lands you currently live on. I would like to pay my respects to the Eora, the people, the Aboriginal people of this land, their ancestors of the past, the people of the present, and those people emerging in the future to lead us forward. Tonight, I am very excited to hear from Jan Brazier, who's the curator for the historic photography collections and also the scientific instrument collections, skills that would have served a 19th century photographer very well because of the amount of scientific knowledge you needed to have to be able to work in that field. The Macleay collections have an immense photography collection, but after 50 years, it was only with CCWM, the Chow Chak Wing Museum, that we were able to have a designated exhibition area to really show the majesty of the collection and the wonders that are there. So it was really exciting when Jan proposed the exhibition, The Business of Photography, investigating a really new area of understanding about photography in New South Wales to be that first exhibition. And tonight she's going to talk about one of the things that she was unable to really do in that exhibition because it was covering such an immense amount of territory, from finding all of the ins and outs and the relationships between the different studios over time to working out how those businesses actually worked. But one of those things was the amount of women who were involved in the business of photography when it was on this industrial kind of scale. And tonight she's going to give us a little bit more information about all of those kinds of ways into finding those histories and revealing some of the stories behind the camera and behind the studio. Thank you, Jan.
It's not working. I can't seem to share. Hang on. It's not moving down. Sorry, I've just got a slight technical hitch. Did you? No. Oh.
That's right.
While Jan figures out
there we are. Sorry.
No, dear. Great.
Sorry, slight technical problem. Sorry, everyone. I don't know why. It's practiced and then I think I'm right. I'll just practice down and up. Okay, thank you. I don't know what happened. We stalled. I appreciate this opportunity to further explore the world of commercial photographic studios, as Jude said, this time bringing into view some of the women in the industry. I've started with this image of the Kerry studio simply to take us into a space that will be some of what I'm talking about and take you into one interior view of a studio. In this talk, I'll be looking firstly at women photographers who earned a living running a photographic studio, those who were proprietors of their own businesses or who worked in partnership with others. These professional photographers made a living selling mainly photographic portraits, and most took the photographs. Operating a camera, you were known as operators. There's another story to be told about amateur photographers in the 19th century, but that would be another interesting project. Then I'll look at women employed by photographic studios, the occupations within a photographic studio, and the roles worked by women, including retouchers, colorists, and receptionists. I'll finish with a brief look at how things were changing in the early 20th century. My focus is on Australia from the introduction of photography in the colonies in the mid-19th century, then briefly looking at the early years of the 20th. My main research has been into New South Wales and comes from research, as Jude mentioned, for the exhibition that I curated. Beginning with the lady photographers. And I'm going to bring up this image, which, although it dates from 1907, is a rare depiction of a woman photographer in her studio, showing you the traditional studio setup with the large camera and the painted backdrop. I'll return to Ada Driver, the subject of the image, later. Research for some time has been undertaken to find and identify women photographers as part of the history of photography, both professional and amateur, from the 19th century to the present day. Alan Davies and Peter Stanbury's 1985 seminal history, The Mechanical Eye in Australia, with its historical survey and long list of studios at the back, brought attention to the work of commercial studios, including some women practitioners. And another important biographical source is the Design and Art Australia online. Interest in this biographical work to locate women photographers has generally been to find them and then to identify their work looking at it as artistic works. But here I want to look at women photographers within the landscape of the business of photography, how they operated and where. I want to acknowledge here the critical importance of Trove in now making the discovery of microhistories possible. In research into commercial photography, it is through this searchable access to advertisements, public notices and articles that underpins much of my research here. Commercial photography is not an area that leaves business records or archives. And now to the lady photographers. How early were women working as commercial photographers in the Australian colonies? Did any take daguerreotypes, those cased photographic portraits that were the beginning of commercial photography? With the announcement of photography in 1839, a new industry was created. The first commercially viable product was the daguerreotype, which was to hold sway into the 1850s. So I put up an example or image of one by an unknown photographer so you could see the format. The daguerreotype was a silver-coated copper plate, polished, sensitized with fumes of iodine, developed over heated mercury. It was a positive image presented in a cased format, and it was a highly reflective mirrored image that held exquisite detail. It was fairly expensive, at 1 guinea, nearly a week's wages for a labourer. Few daguerreotypes survive in Australia from the 1840s and even 1850s, and many have no photographer's name branded on them. The first studio in Sydney was established in December 1842. The first daguerreotypists in colonial Australia were travelling photographers. With the 1840s depression and small population, there wasn't the population to support an ongoing business. But after the gold rushes and new economic prosperity, commercial photographers became an established business presence in Sydney and Melbourne in the 1850s. In 1858, from directories, there appeared to be about 16 studios in Sydney and 12 in Melbourne. So did any women work with daguerreotypes? I've come across one example, that of Madame Charpiot in Ballarat. On the 15th of November 1856, the Ballarat Star, in writing on the fine arts in Ballarat, observed that, quote, opposite to the office of this journal, the admirers of the daguerreotype will find in the rooms of Madame Charpiot another temple of art, and a large collection of specimens attests that lady's skill in the branch she has chosen for practice. I'm just going to put up a little advert. Elizabeth Ann Henwood married Frenchman George Charpiot in 1855. He was a dentist and jeweller. Her photographic practice was in his shop. In 1857, they moved to Genoli in Victoria, where again she advertised her photographic rooms with portraits at all prices, which you can see here. In a blog on Women of Genoli by the Genoli Museum, there is an account of Elizabeth Charpiot where it's noted that, quote, she was regarded as the toughest photographer, whether male or female, on all of the goldfields. According to an account by the Museum of Genoli, they also lived at Talbot and Tarnagulla, where Elizabeth continued to work as a photographer, offering the new popular carte de visite photographic portraits into the 1860s. George died in 1870 and Elizabeth remarried. None of her work is known to have survived. In the mid-1850s, there was a change in technology away from the daguerreotype to what is known as the wet plate process, a process based on a collodion-coated glass negative. Collodion was a sticky emulsion coating of ether, alcohol and gun cotton. Two new photographic products arose. When the collodion negative was backed with black, it appeared as a positive. It was known as a collodion positive or ambrotype portrait, an example seen here. In a case like a daguerreotype, it was cheaper and less effective. Were women working with ambrotypes? There is at least one in Melbourne. As the advertisement I've put up on a part of the screen you'll see. In 1854, Miss Hampson's gallery was advertised in The Age, portraits taken daily by this new and never failing process from 5 shillings upwards. On the 31st of January 1855, the Argus reported on being shown an example of a portrait by this, quote, new development of a daguerreotype, which they saw as an immense improvement on the ordinary daguerreotype, from the establishment at 4 Collins Street East, which, quote, comprises a lady artist who devotes her attention to lady visitors. This was the address of Miss Hampson. She seems to have stopped trading in 1856. The second new product from the collodion-coated glass negative was the paper photographic print. This was to become the basis of modern photography, one negative that could be reproduced many times. It was the development of the carte de visite photographic portrait, the size with a print mounted onto a card the size of a visiting card, that brought the enormous growth in photographic portraiture, with an increase in the number of commercial studios. Everyone could now have their photograph taken, and the newly invented photograph album provided the perfect storage space. They could be given to family and friends. Cartes de visites were a much cheaper product, but as more could be sold, those early into the market made profits. Carte de visite portraits became the bread and butter of the commercial studio business. In the 1860s, women photographers were part of this uptake of this portraiture, which dominated, along with the larger size cabinet card, until the end of the century. In 1867, there's a simple, looking at some of the women who were in practice in the 1860s, in 1861, there was a simple reference in the Bathurst Free Press in a column on the Lachlan area, which simply reported on the town of Forbes that Mrs. Reed has a photographic gallery. These often short newspaper advertisements and notices give little details of the type of photographic practice involved. Elizabeth Reed had advertised from Lambing Flat and the Lachlan Diggings area, and I've put an example of her advertisement here. The Lachlan Diggings were centred on Forbes and were 130 kilometres from Lambing Flat. It's thought that the carte de visite seen here may be the work of Elizabeth Reed. She was variously Reed and R-E-E-D-R-E-I-D. But we don't have her located in Mudgee from yet any source. There's no early digitised Mudgee newspaper. But it looks early, and the handwritten simple name on the back, it just indicates possibly, it just fits the timing. And we could also a reminder by seeing that it's an image of a building, that although the main business was portraits, photographs were also taken outdoors with views of houses and scenes, part of the trade. However, there are few surviving examples of the work of these early photographers. Letitia Davidson, a portrait painter in Melbourne in the 1850s, worked as a photographer in Hobart Town from 1862 to 66 before returning to Melbourne. She was the sister to photographer Frederick Frith. In 1862, in Newcastle, New South Wales, a Mrs. Dewey advertised her portrait saloon, offering, quote, correct and well-finished likenesses at prices considerably below anything yet offered in Newcastle, portraits taken from 2 shillings. Her business only lasted months when in October she published a notice giving thanks for the flattering success which attended her professional career in Newcastle, but in consequence of the state of her health, she was discontinuing her practice as a photographic artist. In Armadale in 1864, Mrs. Markham from her residence was taking photographic portraits on glass and cartes de visites. Could this reference to glass passively mean ambrotypes? Country towns provided opportunities for women to set up a photographic studio. It did not take a large capital investment and possibly was done from the home residence. In the cities, almost all studios were run by men with the role of camera operators seen as belonging to men. Yet studio names do not always reveal gender. An example of that studio is that of the studio Johnston OShaughnessy and Co. In Melbourne in 1862, Emily O'Shaughnessy is listed as a photographer in Carlton. Around 1864, she partnered with Henry Johnston of Johnston and Co. to create the studio Johnston OShaughnessy and Co. It is thought her name was added, albeit with a slightly different spelling, to differentiate their name from another studio, Johnston and Co. Johnston OShaughnessy and Co. became a leading Melbourne studio. Henry Johnston was the artist. Emily married George Haysler, who'd come in to manage the studio and continued to do so after Johnston left in 1876. How long she worked and what work she did is unknown. Possibly it ended in September 1869 when her formal partnership with Henry Johnston was dissolved. It was carried on by Johnston and George Haysler, but the studio trading with the same name. Jack Cato, in his The Story of the Camera in Australia, attributes their success to the fact that Johnston was an active Anglican and O'Shaughnessy an ardent Catholic, and soon they got the best of both possible worlds. But not all women running photographic studios were photographers. However, in these cases, it was generally in partnership with husbands or with a family connection, or taking up the reins on becoming a widow, or occasionally independently. Myra Felton was the daughter of Maurice Felton, a celebrated painter in oil. In 1859, the Sydney Morning Herald reported that she had, quote, for some time been engaged in the galleries of some of our most popular photographists as a finisher in colours. Now, however, Miss Felton has a studio of her own in Hunter Street and has been very successful in taking by this process and perfecting in colours a goodly number of portraits. She ended up by 1867 working as an artist and portrait painter only and ran an art academy. Her brother Thomas Felton was a photographer who'd taken over Edward Dalton's, and it's unclear who maybe did the photography, but she was certainly an artist colorist who was running her own business. Another artist involved in running of a studio was Eliza Allen in Sydney. Eliza and her husband Oswald Allen operated a studio from 1864. Both had worked for Edward Dalton, along with her son from her first marriage, William Bradley. Eliza, as an artist, ran the artistic department, while Oswald the camera side. I'll talk more about the role of artists later. While the studio was mostly trading as Oswald Allen, for a brief period of time, the studio imprint, Mr. and Mrs. Oswald Allen, was printed on the backs of their carte de visites, an example seen here. In Adelaide in 1879, Mary Jane Davis, widow of Henry Davis, who died in 1878, took over their studio business, which traded as the Adelaide Photographic Company. Davis had run the studio since about 1865. In an investigation into a fire at the studio in 1879, Mary Jane Davis revealed that she attended to the financial portion of the business, employing an operator, a female apprentice, and a young male printer. The studio assets were sold soon after. long accounts in newspapers of events such as fires or where there's investigations often can bring some of these details to light. And in this image of Isabella and James Taylor in South Australia, and it's a lovely image showing a studio premises with the shop windows displaying their photographic works. We know from an obituary when she died in 1970, where it just says she was one of the first lady portrait operators in South Australia. That women photographers were not uncommon can be seen in the paragraph in the ladies column in the Illustrated Sydney News in 12th of June 1871, titled Lady Photographers, and I quote, "Photography hardly seems a lady's art. Delicate fingers look out of place dabbling in nasty chemical solutions and out of condition when dyed with the inevitable silver stains. Yet the fair sex have again and again beaten the rough in the photographic lists. Delicacy, cleanliness, patience, and we had almost said long suffering, are woman's attributes, and they are necessary conditions to success in photographic operations. No wonder then photography has provided considerable employment for women, and that it has in turn benefited by the handiwork of its employees." In the 1880s, another technical development occurred with the change from the wet to the dry plate process. This meant that the glass plates were now coated with gelatin. They were faster with exposures in parts of a second. They did not have to be used within 2 or 3 minutes while wet, so they were easier to carry around. The photographer could travel further and was less busy. It also brought the development of manufacturers who actually started to produce sensitized plates and providing them back to photographers. But the portrait products remained, the carte de visite and the cabinet card. A rare example of a woman photographer commenting on her experience can be seen in this following exchange in 1880. It began with a column, the ladies' column, written by Gypsy, published in the Australian Town and Country Journal, in a section titled "A Lady Photographer, Melbourne." And she wrote, "A young lady in Melbourne has opened a photographic studio, the operating portion of which is undertaken by herself and performed with satisfaction to her patrons, the greater part of whom are ladies and children. Miss Elliot has taste, which she exercises in the skillful disposal of her clients' drapery and finery in a manner that would make a masculine operator pale with envy. And as she better understands the feminine whims and foibles, it is not to be wondered at that her painstaking urbanity is rewarded by the patronage of a numerous clientele," end quote. Gypsy observed her photos showed great skill and finish of detail, and that mentions her close study for the last 5 years of photography, her work equal to the best in Melbourne. And quote, wrote, "If the same advantages of education and training were afforded us, we should not be far behind the lordly specimens of humanity." Miss R. Elliot had opened her studio not long before this mention. A response to Gypsy's column, I'm just going to put up the work of the person I'll be talking about. A response to Gypsy's column was published in her next column in the Evening News, and it was titled "A New South Wales Lady Photographer." Gypsy reported that 4 carts from a Mrs. Nicholas had been received, which, she wrote, will compete favourably with many of the specimens turned out of a masculine photographic studio. The images sent in were of a young woman, a man in railway guard's uniform, infant, and a view of a church. And this photo is one of the ones from Mrs. Nicholas, who's the subject of this column. Then a letter to the editor from Mrs. W.A. Nicholas of Fernshade, Jordan's Crossing near Bundanoon was published. Mrs. Nicholas wrote, referring to Gypsy's column on the 3rd of April, speaking of a lady photographer having started a studio in Melbourne as something fresh. Mrs. Nicholas wrote, and I quote, "I think the mother colony can claim precedence with Victoria, as I have during the last 9 years travelled through all the towns on the Southern Railway between Sydney and Wagga Wagga, following the fascinating art of photography. I do all my own operating and am now temporarily located in Goulburn, having introduced the gem style there." Just briefly an aside, the gem style was a small postage size little portrait, which is in a format called a tintype, done on lacquered black iron. It was inexpensive portraiture, and presented in a carte de visite mount like seen here, it could be easily added to a photograph album. Sarah Nicholas continued in her letter. Gypsy speaks of Miss Elliot as a convincing proof of the capabilities of our sex, and that if the same advantages of education and training were afforded to us as to the opposite sex, we should not be far behind. Perhaps we are given the educational part as much as men are, and no doubt if men would select their wives from the ranks of useful girls instead of from the votaries of fashion, you would oftener hear of women's capabilities. Or on the other hand, if husbands were to take their wives more into their confidence over their business affairs and teach them their business when practicable, instead of only too often looking on them as a family drudge to prepare their meals, etc., they would not so often go to the insolvent court or leave their wives and families in destitution. I have to thank my husband for teaching me the art. I'll mention in passing that her husband, William Nicholas, had ended up earlier in the insolvency court. And on this example, a rare example that I found of the work of the Nicholases, it is faint, but on the reverse side, you can faintly read their names, Mr. and Mrs. Nicholas, Fernglades, Jordan's Crossing. The Nicholases were a family of photographers, William and Sarah based in Bundanoon, but also travelling photographers. Sarah died in 1894. William's brother George, a travelling photographer in New South Wales, then settling in Cootamundra, then Wellington. After George's death in 1912, his wife Clara continued to run the studio for 16 years. There's a book published on Sarah and William, George and Clara, titled Travelling Photographers by Maureen and Bud Townsend, published in 2015. Local and family histories hopefully will bring more details on early women photographers. So around country New South Wales, women continued to work as professional photographers, including in the far west New South Wales. In November 1891, a special reporter by the initials JFH wrote an account of visiting Wilcannia, published in the Sydney Mail. And he wrote, "I met here the first lady photographer I have ever seen who does her own operating, finishing and all, no male assistant. Mrs. M.E. Brazile is the unselfish artist to whom I refer and to whom work is love and her idol. I admire her energy and her pluck, and I admire her excellent photography." Sadly, in 1892, Mary Elizabeth Brazile filed for bankruptcy. This is one of the only insolvency or bankruptcy files I've seen for a woman photographer. She claimed her bankruptcy was due to ill health and the claims of the creditor. And I've just put up an extract of the claims of the creditor, who was a Grace Mullins from Bucknell Street, Newtown, Sydney. And I find this document a puzzle as it details unusual things like freight between Sydney and Wilcannia and amounts for retouching and printing and colouring negatives. But it's an indication that and a file such as bankruptcy or an insolvency do reveal are a good source of information. It was revealed in Mary Brazile's bankruptcy case that she failed to keep books of accounts as are usual and proper, and that she only kept a diary showing daily transactions. She was later to remarry after divorcing from her husband Herbert Brazile in 1894. And it's unclear how long she worked. There is an advertisement suggesting she traded on in 1896 in business in 1896. In 1893 in Glen Innes, the reference is made to the work of a local lady artist, Mrs. Wright, quoting it from the Glen Innes Examiner. Not only is the mechanical portion of the process of photography carried out to perfection in the pictures that this lady showed us, but they displayed the far higher gift of the choice of position and point of view from which the subjects are represented. She was also proficient in pencil and paintbrush. And it was also observed that she works with, quote, a splendid camera fitted with the latest improvements and accessories in a well-appointed studio. But setting up a studio was harder in the city, where it's probably more competitive, and yet there were a few who did. Laura Prager had been in a photographic partnership with Roland Chubb in Sydney in 1889. The partnership ended in December 1890, and she continued to carry on the business alone, trading, as you can just see here, as the name Empire Galleries. She divorced her husband in December 1893, Francis Prager, due to drunkenness and desertion, and was to marry George Harland in 1894. In 1892, some of her photographs were seen in an exhibition of works being sent as to be part of the women's department in the Chicago World International Fair. Laura Prager claimed that she was the only lady operator in Sydney. This was likely in the 1890s, which were very difficult years. They were years of depression, and they were years of great competition between photographic studios, with price cutting, seeing some studios going out of business. Sometimes photographic cases were played out in court. This was the case with Annie Walker, inheritor of the estate of Sydney photographer Thomas Henry Boyd. In 1880, Thomas Boyd opened his studio, Boyd's San Francisco Palace of Art, at 262 George Street. He also carried on business as a photographic stock importer. He died intestate on August 1883, and his estate was granted to schoolmistress Annie Walker. She became guardian of his infant children. On October 1882, Annie Walker cleverly applied to register the Boyd studio trademark, as seen here on the right from the National Archives, and on the left is Boyd's original imprint. She then took legal action against William Cargill, a late partner of Boyd's, in the Supreme Court to prevent him from stamping photographs with the name Boyd on the front and the decorative design device on the back, similar to this trademark. The partnership of Boyd and Cargill from 1881 had dissolved. But Cargill still had mounts with the facsimile of this design, which he was using. So the injunction was granted to Annie Walker for Cargill to desist. A detailed account can be found in the New South Wales Law Reports. Annie Walker then, in February 1885, offered a £50 reward for information where the name or trademark of Boyd was used without permission. She continued to trade as the new Palace of Art, working with different male managers and photographers. In Melbourne in 1883, a court case played out as to the rights as where to trade in a dispute between Lydia Birch Dalba, wife of operatic artist Senor Thomas Dalba, but she was formerly photographic artist Lydia Robinson. So in the court case between her and William Tuttle of Tuttle and Co. For some years, they were partners in Melbourne and Sydney as photographers, the Sydney business being under the management of William Tuttle and the Melbourne under Lydia. They adopted and used the signature Tuttle and Co on their places of business, impressed on their photographs, envelopes, invoices. On the 21st of September 1883, the partnership was dissolved. She bought out the Melbourne business, paying £1,500. Lydia Dalber sued William Tuttle to restrain him from carrying on business in Melbourne and Hawthorn after their separation and using the name Tuttle or Original Tuttle, which he alleged he continued to operate in Melbourne. In the Supreme Court, it was found for Lydia, the judgment, and she was awarded £250 for the loss she had sustained, with William Tuttle given an injunction to restrain use of the name in Melbourne. Turning from the lady photographers to the wage earners, while women could run their own studios, there were women who were employed by studios and now looking behind the scenes, because taking the photograph was only the beginning of the process to the final product. This image comes from a photographic supply company, Brazier. When looking at the various roles women were employed in within a photographic studio, I just briefly mentioned we should not forget the work of the unpaid workers, particularly wives. An early Sydney studio in Sydney was that of William Hetzer, who set up business in 1850. His wife was Thekla Hetzer. Jack Cato, in his book, The Story of the Camera in Australia, recounts an anecdote from Judge Docker saying that she helped out in the studio. She certainly contributed to the family through teaching music, German and French lessons. Thomas Glaister, who ran also one of Sydney's top studios in the mid-1850s, in 1857, unusually in an advertisement about his accommodation for ladies and children at his studio, he wrote, "Mrs. G is constantly in attendance." If studios were often as part in the family home, it's obviously the assistance of family would occur. Visiting a photographic studio needed to be a reputable experience for women to visit. After climbing flights of stairs up to a gallery-level studios, reception rooms were furnished with elegant furnishings, separate dressing rooms for women and men, and women attendants. After the sitting in the production of photographs, there were a number of discrete steps involving operator, retoucher, mounter, finisher, colorist, and the receptionist, which are gendered occupational roles. First, the sitter selects the style of picture required. Then an adjournment is made to the studio where the operator gets to work. After the plates are processed, it goes to the retoucher, after which proofs come in, then more retouching. The printer takes off copies and the mounter and finisher does his or her work. In a very large studio, there was a definite division of labour. But even in small businesses, no one person did all the steps, although they might combine roles such as receptionist and retoucher. The specific talents of women were often referred to as neatness, nimbleness of manipulation, and delicacy of touch. They were also thought to work, of course, very well with ladies and be adept with children. Job advertisements revealed the occupations of women in studios. Advertisements from the 1860s on would ask for a lady attendant, first-class lady photographer colorist, good retoucher young lady preferred, active young girl as apprentice for finishing room, or alarmingly by J. Rorty in Sydney in 1873, a young girl as an apprentice with no salary for the first 3 months. As mentioned, the role, looking at operators, the role of camera operator was very much a male role. Women were rarely employed as operators until late in the century. Yet there were some women practitioners that occasionally come to notice. William Tuttle, who we've referred to, who went bankrupt in 1899, in his statement he revealed that to start up his Adelaide branch, he'd borrowed from his wife, and that she had worked in the business with him for 8 years when he was in business, and that he'd paid her. When his photographic apparatus was seized, the one his wife had had for some years was also seized, but paid for by her own money. One of the areas that women were employed in the photographic studio was the work of retouchers. Retouchers was a skilled role where they worked on the negative, removing technical imperfections, working with a soft lead pencil to reduce wastes, remove double chins, soften wrinkles and remove freckles. An article on the work of the retoucher could be called Faces Made to Order or Making the Plane Beautiful. The women could earn good money if they were highly skilled in this area. J. Brooks Thornley ran the Fork studio, said they were as good as men, but they were cheaper. And often in a team of retouchers, the head retoucher would be male. Some worked for themselves outside the studio. And here's an advertisement for Miss Morgan, retouching expert. Amateur negatives carefully and judiciously retouched, the likenesses being retained in every instance. Special short course of instruction for amateurs wishing to retouch their own negatives or single lessons. Professional course can be arranged. For retouchers working at the desk, peering at glass negatives was hard on the eyesight. In a report on the way of the worker, focusing on retouchers in the Evening News in June 1905, it said, quote, "The work is most trying. They sit day in, day out at their retouching desk in a darkened room from 9 till 5 in winter, 9 till 5:30 in summer, remuneration from 15 shillings upwards, occasionally 2.5 notes a week, the exception." I turn now to the receptionist, and again, here is the image of Carey's studio, which I think may be the receptionist in view. This was a critical role in the studio, the respectable front face for the studio visit. Mark Blow, proprietor of the very large Crown Studios, wrote in 1918, "We cannot overestimate the importance of first-class business tactics in the reception room. The pleasant manner of approach, the business smile of welcome, the discreet feeling after the intentions of the customer, and the delicate influence to improve the order are some of the virtues of good receptionist." The skills of the receptionist were tact, being a quick thinker, pleasant and courteous, and ability to discuss styles and prices. The names of workers occasionally are revealed in studios, and just briefly putting this up in an article Quentin Burke wrote on Charles Carey's studio, trying to identify and list the principal members. It's the bottom line which lists the female members of the staff. Artists and colourists were often women, were sometimes on staff, and they sometimes worked for themselves. To have colour, an artist needed to hand colour a photograph using watercolours or oils to tint or even overpaint the photographic image. In miniature painters, with the introduction of photography, found work in the new business when being employed by studios. In 1855, James and William Freeman, they were the Freeman Brothers studio, commented on colouring daguerreotypes that they were sending a lady to study the art in Paris, quoting, "What a new field of exertion this opens for ladies with a taste for drawing." We saw earlier on the work of Eliza Allen in the Oswald Allen studio. Her delicate tinted carte de visite portraits were wildly admired. And in an advertisement for Mrs. Bentley, late Miss Hunt, for many years at Dalton's, she advertised that she coloured photographs privately and for the profession at her home. And occasionally in advertisements, the actual name of the staff, but the colourist appears. And here in the advertisement for the American Gem and General Photographic Company is the name of Miss White, colourist. Very quickly, I see, I just wanted to show that instructions for, I came across this example of instructions for colouring from our collection. This is a Brisbane studio, Samuel Dewsbury, and the wording on the back of this carte de visite reads, Mrs. Smith, 2 weeks, cabinet print, child, hair pale as shown, eyes light blue, fair, blue dress, white lace. Mrs. Smith, fair hair as shown, light blue eyes, light brown clothes. The division of labour and the gendered roles can be seen in the studio in this amazing illustration showing the Crown Studios, one of the largest in Sydney. All the various roles are shown here, and the ones in featuring Sydney here are the ones showing women here are the offices, framing room and mounting room. And further idea to get the official listing of wages by occupational role is in this table from the Statistical Register of 1899, where you can clearly see roles that were defined for females, roles that were paid for female and males, and the males clearly the operator. I've just briefly mentioning changing industrial landscape, which I've only done a short amount of research into. The Factories and Shops Acts regulated employment of women and girls in factories and fixed hours of work. In a case in 1901, under the Victorian Factories and Shops Act, it was to prevent people being employed without wages, even if receiving instruction. Eden George, proprietor of the large Sydney and Melbourne studios, was charged with employing pupils without wages. He argued the pupil had paid money for instruction to learn the retouching business, but at question here in this case was, were photographer studios a factory subject to the Act? On one, there were two cases, two young girls involved in this case. One charge was dismissed, but on another, he was fined. There was no industrial agreement specific to photography that I know of until a 1904 agreement between Kerry and Co and the Photographic Employees Association of New South Wales. Some extracts that are on screen here. I think it was in 1912 that an industrial award for the sector became law after the formation in 1911 of a Photographic Employees Union. Briefly, I just want to consider briefly changes into the new century. With the newly federated Australia, the rise of the amateur with the Kodak camera, the changing technologies again with smaller studios possible with silver gelatin papers and easier darkroom processing. And women, I think, were more visible with profiles in the cities, their studios. I'm wondering if the business in country towns diminished in the country where long-term settled businesses were run by men. And briefly, I'm just going to show you, and I can see I'm possibly running out of time, but I just want to show you some examples of women working in these early years of the 20th century. Harriet Brims with her own studio in Ingham and then Mareeba, working in northern Queensland for 10 years. Her husband made her wooden cameras. Her collection of 600 glass negs is held at the State Library, Queensland, possibly a rare example of original works. Ada Driver, who we saw before, opened her own studio in Brisbane in 1906, employed assistants, many of whom were women. The Ina Darcy studios in Sydney were set up by Annie Bain and Ada Small, connected, they'd come from the Bain studios of Brisbane and Toowoomba, and they could report that they had a lady operator from abroad in attendance. Judith Fletcher set up in the North Shore studio from 1908 into the 1920s. In this portrait of her in the Daily Telegraph, they claimed that she was the first woman to start a photographer's business in Sydney, a claim that we can now see is not quite accurate. And then in the changing aesthetic to pictorialism, away from the painted backgrounds and the Victorian poses seen as stuffy and perhaps inartistic, here is May Moore, and starting her new business, new studio in Sydney in 1911, a studio devoid of ornamentation with no conventional backgrounds, severe plain walls and dark green hangings, perhaps to our eyes a more modern portrait. I want to conclude with these images on screen showing some of the staff of Freeman's Studio, a studio which was begun in the 1850s by brothers William and James. On the left, staff at the Freeman Studio in 1900, Madeline Denshire and her sister Muriel, Miss Halls seated and Gwen Burns. Miss Halls was the receptionist. On the right, Gwen Burns and Alice. Clara Halls in 1939 was mentioned in an article in The Sun about having been 48 years in one job. She'd begun, as she said, in the gay 1890s. She took the place of Mary McKelly, who'd been with the firm for 42 years. I hope from this look at the landscape of 19th century commercial photographic studios, with the focus particularly on the work of lady photographers and the women employed by the studios, that the history of professional photography can be seen as incomplete without their conclusion. Thank you.
Just to thank you very much, Jan. It's a small applause, but I'm sure everybody joined.
Sorry about the frozen screen at the beginning.
No, saying that it was really interesting and a huge depth of difference between the eras of the 50s right through to the 20th century, which is amazing. So there are some questions that people have. The first one that came up was to ask from Michelle, are there any records of women taking botanical or landscape photographs in the field?
One of the problems is much of this work doesn't survive. So this is one of the cases that we actually have few examples of their work. When I put up that earlier photograph by possibly Elizabeth Reed at the building, and the one by Laura Prager, which also showed a house, I'm sure that they would have gone out and taken some views of towns or some scenes, but we actually don't have the evidence of their works. My great hope is that in some of these country places, in a family carte de visite album, they may very well survive. So botanical, I don't know. Landscape, I feel sure they would have. And once you get to the 20th century, Harriet Brin's up in Queensland, she certainly did. So.
The other question, is there one female in particular who stood out for you as a mover or a shaker or very talented? Personally, I love the quote about useful girls. I think it's absolutely fantastic.
I'm not sure that there was one. I suppose I come back to Sarah Nicholas, simply because you get a sense of her from her letter to the editor and what she wrote, and that the fact in her ads that she was travelling around with her name appearing. So, but again, in public collections, very few that I know of their works. However, if you do read the book on them, there are more photographs published there and some in private hands. But I think her character comes through.
And do you know if women travelled around as solo travellers doing the photography work? Do you get any sense of how they moved around the country? Because they're obviously very mobile.
Some, yes. It's very hard to tell. I thought Sarah Nicholson sort of suggests she was alone. It's a bit hard to tell. I'm not sure. Yes, the evidence still has to be found.
One for more research. There was a question about, can you tell us a bit more about what a daguerreotype is? Why is it so hard?
Why is it so hard?
As a practice, technically, why is it so difficult?
I'm not sure that it was difficult in the sense that, I mean, people learned to be daguerreotypists. They could buy a kit and they learned. It was a particular process. It involved obviously those noxious chemicals, but many people could learn to be a daguerreotypist and travel around with the kit. But what happened with the daguerreotype was that it was the first commercially viable product, but when it first came out, there was a feeling that people looked like cadavers in it because of it was still developing as a technology, and the images that were quite harsh. That improved, and by the 1850s, they were producing quite exquisite, well-lit, coloured daguerreotypes. But I think it was simply a technology. It held sway for quite a long time, for over more than 10 years. But it was expensive, and it was very mirrored and very hard to see, and it was in a case that you had to carry around. So it sort of had its day, and the other technology, which was the reproducible print, was to be the one that went forward.
Yeah. On a related question, you mentioned that women didn't last very long in the industry, and is that because of just sort of the general health of the times, or do you think it had to do with the chemistry that was involved in the practice?
Sorry, it didn't last long in
the industry. So women didn't end up sort of working in the industry maybe past their sort of 40s or 50s. Do you think?
It's sort of become, it is interesting, and it probably needs more research. And I became aware of this, there more practitioners in the country towns, and trying to map how many years they did work when they set up. So some were, it seems to be a few years, but you also have to remember that generally in the photographic studios, there was a range, so that there were other just male run photographic studios that only had brief lives and weren't profitable, and then others found a market and were profitable. So I think, and then once you get later, like in the early 20th century, some of them were operating studios then for many years. So I think it's a mixed bag of experience.
And possibly the volatility of the industry in those early years.
And also the economic period of the times, like, and then like you get the carte de visite that comes, but then you get, you know, too many in the industry, so it falls back. And then you get the 1890s depression, which led to severe price cutting amongst photographers, and because you get a change with the growth of the big studios and who could undercut the work. So Mark Blow at Crown was, you know, he shook them all up because he came in and said, I will sell cheaper, but I can sell so many, I'll make a profit. So there's a broader context in the industry in which they're working.
Back to the daguerreotypes just briefly. Do you know who made the cases? Because they're so detailed with those velvet insets and leather, and was it part of the business?
My understanding is you bought them. So there was a whole separate industry that's not mentioned, which is the supply of photographic materials. And once you got photography, you got another economy, photographic economy. So there were businesses that sold the chemicals, they sold the glass, they sold the cases, they could sell the mounts. It's a sort of parallel industry, and people would order. The cases could be American made or English made, and they'd be imported.
Right. A couple of questions that I'll put together. Are the cases, the examples that you've talked about here, exhaustive, or are they just examples to document the practice? Like, is this all of the women involved, or is this just a selection? And in that, how did you, like, do any archives fully survive? It really is just these fragments?
Yeah, so it's very hard to do, I think, to do numbers, and it is hard to necessarily find them all. So, then as you could see, perhaps there's not a great number. I tried counting through the back of the mechanical eye for how many. And so I think we've really could build this up to try and locate them. So some is serendipitous. I found like I'd be doing something else and I'd actually see an advertisement for one of them. There's an existing group that you can pull out through what people have already done through like the mechanical eye and others. But it's very difficult because you can work from SANS directories and you might look through for the names that are Mrs. or Miss. But then I tried to indicate that sometimes studio names don't indicate the gender. So, and as you do more research, you do find the name. So no, they're not the whole story by any means of the ones I referred to tonight. Possibly the early ones are, because I've only found those first two very early, but there could be more, but I'd say from the 1860s, 70s on, probably more names will pop up. So yes, it is a hunt.
It's a thrilling hunt. It is amazing what you found.
But you get the frustrations. You said records. So SANS directories, for example, wonderful for certain things, but in the New South Wales, they don't cover the country till much, much later. So you trying to look for someone in Mudgee and you don't have a newspaper and you don't have a directory. So, you're still hunting through these sources. What I found generally on commercial photography is that there aren't archives. Mary Brasnell wasn't the only one who didn't keep records. It was often reported they really had minimal, from what I can see, business records, account books, register of negatives. When I was researching Charles Kerry, he ran a medium, big studio for many years. To find his letterhead, I came across it because he wrote to the Sydney City Council. So you don't find I'm aware of, a great set of business records. So you've got to look in the government, you've got to look at where they encountered officialdom, and when they wrote to complain about rats in the lane, you might get their letterhead.
We'll end with that. Given that the back ways into dental studios and through bookshops and everything else seem to be the photographer's lot for much of the 19th century. Thank you very much, Jan. Most of the comments that I've seen pouring through are to say thank you so much for a really interesting talk. Lots of them are asking you to tag Trove to put up all of your sources, to publish what you've written and various other things. But yeah, I'll join all of those people in saying thank you so much. It was really engaging, interesting talk. And I'll pass over to Craig to let those of you here know what's coming next. Thanks, Jan.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jude, and add my voice too. Thank you, Jan. That was amazing talk. I've learned so much, like everyone else. For everyone listening in tonight, and hopefully you've enjoyed that presentation as much as I have. But just to say that in these difficult times where we have such uncertainty because of COVID, the Chow Chak Wing Museum team are doing our very best to bring the museum to you until we can reopen again safely. And as a result, we're busy planning a whole series of digital presentations and digital outreach. Join us next Thursday at 12:30 for an incredibly special film screening and associated conversation with community associated with the Daguerreotype exhibition of Your New Art and Culture, and continuing the theme of the Daguerreotype exhibition on the evening of Thursday, the 5th of August at 6:30 p.m. Dr. Bentley James will be giving a presentation on the illustrated handbook of Your New Sign Language. On top of that, a whole lot of other things we've got planned in the works that we will be announcing in the next couple of weeks. To find out more, please visit our website, subscribe to our e-newsletter called Muse Extra, or follow the Chow Chak Wing Museum on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. Otherwise, thank you everyone for joining us this evening. Thank you again, Jan, for an amazing talk. Please be safe. And we at the Chow Chak Wing Museum look forward to seeing you digitally and then hopefully in the not too distant future in person soon. Thank you, everybody.